I'd like to take a few minutes and just discuss a supplemental aspect of the teaching on Matthew 13. So many times when we teach Matthew 13 the way Jesus spoke it in its original intent, it ruffles a lot of feathers because the typical scenario that is taught in North America is that there is a rapture of the church, the Christians. They're caught up into the air for a period of anywhere from 3.5 to 7 years. And then they come back to win a victorious battle with Jesus Christ at the end of the Great Tribulation at Armageddon. And then, of course, Jesus sets up his 1,000-year millennial reign on earth. And then it's really fuzzy and foggy what happens after that. But this is the scenario that's taught. And it is easy to see if you're reading the scriptures from just a English current perspective, especially appealing to the five senses of man and not the spirit of man, that indeed that does save our flesh. That does give us an escape in that mentality from what some would call the wrath of God, others would just call tribulation. Jesus doesn't say that, and especially in Matthew 13, it's almost reversed. In fact, it is in reality. So you need a little backdrop of where all this came from. And that's what I wanted to do with the next few minutes here, is kind of just share with you the history behind that doctrine, with also the presentation in grace that just because someone believes that way does not make them a bad person or a lesser Christian. It does not mean they're going to go to hell for bad eschatology. It means simply that they are not reading the scriptures the way Christ spoke them in this arena and this doctrine of thought. Christ taught us a certain sequence and a certain chronology there in Matthew 13. But what we have to do is go back and look at the history. When we look at the history of this particular doctrine, it comes across as almost understandable because it all started back in the late 1700s, maybe the early 1800s. There was a minister by the name of John Nelson Darby. J.N. Darby is how we typically refer to him now. And he caught wind of some people's dreams and some ecstatic, quote, visions that some people were having in various parts of the nation. And he started researching the Bible, as a good minister would, and seeing if these things fit. And because there was a narrow scope on original language, and the Greek was not as well defined as it is now because of archaeology, he read more from the English Bible or an English translation of the Bible and came up with this doctrine that we typically call a pre-tribulation dispensational theology of end times. And of course that name will vary a little bit with each particular group that uses it. It's important to understand though that J.N. Darby meant well, but just because you mean well doesn't mean you do well. And that's part of the problem here. At the end of the Revolutionary War, there was a lot of psychological damage that reflected in people's hearts and their spirits. And this would have been in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And ministers and pastors and bishops of groups of churches were always looking for a way to lift people's spirit, to help them understand the place that they were in life with what had just happened in a post-revolutionary war world. Some of these people had lost many relatives in that battle. Some of them had lost relatives simply because of political views, because some people remained loyalists to the throne of England. In fact, many of them went back to England, and so families were separated. There was tension because people didn't think alike. There was all kinds of different views, even on things like slavery, as early as in the early 1800s. And so these churches were looking for ways to kind of lift people's hearts and their spirits up a little bit. And one of these ways came into focus of kind of providing a view of the end of the world as being something rather glamorous and exceptionally joyous and maybe even victorious in a weird way for Christians to latch onto. And so in that they provided this escape mentality that you will not have to suffer like you just did through the Revolutionary War. And Christ is going to come and pull you out. And of course, not knowing what certain words meant in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians about being caught up and things like that, not knowing the depth of that language at the time, it was an easy doctrine to contrive. The problem was it dealt strictly with, or mainly with, the flesh, and not really with the spiritual side of it. And it had to ignore certain passages that Jesus himself spoke. Those were important to know and to understand why they came about. So where did all this come from? Well, it started basically with this guy named J.N. Darby, the best we can tell. And it developed from there. And from J.N. Darby, another gentleman by the name of C.I. Scofield picked up on this doctrine and started preaching and teaching. And he ended up putting a commentary together. And the commentary was more of a written explanation, which he eventually combined into what we know as the C.I. Scofield Study Bible, which is still in print today. It's been changed, it's been modified, but the same core doctrine of eschatology, the end times, which he had kind of picked up from J.N. Darby, is still relevant to that particular version of the Bible and that commentary Bible. They in turn published that, and it went completely around the United States of America, and probably it's about at that time that that doctrine started spreading out of the North American continent into the rest of the world, because it had not been taught anywhere else at that time. So we see this migration from the teachings of J.N. Darby to C.I. Scofield, but that's not really where it stopped. So we see the C.I. Scofield Bible out there, but it really came into vogue in our day and age with a couple different ministers, but some of the main voices in that particular doctrine were obviously the ministry of Billy Graham, starting in the late 1940s, and also a radio broadcaster by the name of J. Vernon McGee. Both of these men preached the gospel, and of course, even looking back at C.I. Scofield and also at J.N. Darby, these men were Christians. They wanted to preach the gospel and see the world come to Christ. So we don't fault them for their salvation's sake or for their relationship with Christ. We simply say, was this doctrine biblically sound? And it apparently wasn't. As we watched many evangelists use the doctrine of the rapture as kind of a scare technique to a certain point to get people to convert to Christianity within the North American region in these massive crusades like Billy Graham and other such evangelists had. We see them using the rapture as a key element to stir people to come to Christ. For some, that worked, but for others, it was simply just a scare tactic that may have shocked them for moments or days or weeks, and then they abandoned their faith from that. J. Vernon McGee taught very thoroughly this doctrine, obviously from a very English Bible and from not a well-versed understanding of the Greek that was originally written in the first century. J. Vernon McGee and other such ministers who promoted this doctrine avoided Matthew 13 like the plague. And there's a reason why. It's because it doesn't fit with their doctrine. Yet it's what Jesus himself taught and what he exactly said in his own scenario. And so it's important, I think, that we understand, where it came from and how it was passed down through the last couple hundred years. We don't hear the cry of the rapture and the tribulation as much as we used to, simply because of what has happened currently in our day and age. The reason for this is because basically what we find is that a lot of the major media ministries that were promoting this started indulging themselves in either date setting or marginalizing the parameter by which the date could be placed in. In my lifetime, and I will tell you I'm over 60 years of age, I've heard such dates set on major occasions on 5 different times. Obviously, Jesus has not come back. The rapture did not take place. And so therefore, it kind of lends itself to be a dying doctrine. There are still people who believe it, and they are still Christians. And we still love them, and they are our brothers and sisters in the Lord. Again, this is not something to separate over. It is something that I encourage Christians to look at and say, what if? And why don't we listen to the words of Christ? And why do not we use the Bible as our point of reference for that doctrine? And again, there are verses that they would claim and use to support that particular doctrine, but they're contrary to this passage, especially in Matthew 13. And that's where we have to say, okay, what is really going on here? Where did it come from? And how are we going to take a position that is somewhat biblically correct? And Jesus is very clear in Acts chapter 1 to say, you don't know when it's going to happen. And we don't. And we shouldn't live like it's going to happen. On the other hand, we can know that it could happen anytime. Jesus can come back whenever it's time. And we don't have any say over that. The Bible gives us hints as to when that could be by certain signs and the times. But certainly the process or the chronology that we've looked at in these Matthew 13 teachings gives us a whole different angle than what we have been taught for the last 200 years through these teachers such as J.N. Darby and C.I. Schofield and J. Vernon McGee and many of the evangelists, the major media evangelists that have been out there over the last 40 to 50 years. And it's important that we know and love one another despite maybe the variances in understanding this, but it's also very important to understand that the scriptures are the key point of reference for everything we should believe in our Christian faith.